It's 1300. The air smells of wood smoke, mud, and unwashed humanity. Life for most is a brutal, relentless grind. Disease sweeps through villages like an angry god, famine gnaws at bellies, and the threat of war is never far off. When we think of this era, our minds conjure images of young knights, fair maidens, and perhaps grizzled elders. But rarely do we picture a wedding where both the bride and groom have already seen 5 decades, sometimes more. It's almost laughable, isn't it? The very idea of marriage after 50 in a world where reaching that age felt like a miracle. We're taught to believe that people drop dead in their 30s, that old age was a luxury reserved for a tiny, blessed elite. But the truth, as it often is with history, is far more nuanced, far stranger, and honestly, a lot more human than our simplified narratives allow. The popular image of medieval life expectancy, the one where everyone expired before they hit 40, is a bit of a statistical illusion. Yes, infant mortality was horrifyingly high. A huge chunk of the population didn't make it past their first birthday, let alone their 5th or 10th, that skews the numbers dramatically. If you managed to survive childhood, if you dodged the common childhood diseases, if you didn't succumb to the plague or a random axe wound, your chances of living to a ripe old age, or at least into your 50s and 60s, actually increased quite significantly. It wasn't common, no, but it also wasn't unheard of. There were old men and old women, their faces weathered like ancient oak trees, their bodies carrying the scars of a hard life. And for some of these individuals, a wedding was still on the cards. This isn't about some romantic notion of finding love late in life, at least not in the way we understand it today. Forget all your modern sensibilities about companionship and shared interests being the bedrock of a union. In 1300, marriage was a contract, a transaction, a strategic alliance. It was about land, lineage, labor, and above all, survival. So when a man or woman, having navigated 50 years of this harsh existence, considered taking a new spouse, their motivations were deeply practical, almost brutally pragmatic. It sheds a light on human adaptability, doesn't it? The sheer will to keep going, to find solutions, even when it meant standing at an altar, perhaps for the 2nd or even 3rd time, with someone who might be almost a stranger. To truly grasp what this meant, to see how these individuals managed to stitch together a life in a world so alien to our own, requires a deeper look, a willingness to unearth these forgotten histories. If you're as curious as I am about these hidden corners of the past, consider sticking around, maybe even subscribing, because there's so much more to uncover. Now imagine Agnes. She's perhaps 52, a widow. Her husband, Thomas, died last winter, taken by the flux that swept through the village, leaving her with a small cottage, a scrap of land, and a couple of grown children who have their own families to worry about, or maybe they've moved away, or even died themselves. She's strong, Agnes, but the fields don't till themselves. The fire doesn't fetch its own wood, and the nights are long and cold. Her plight wasn't unique. For a woman, being a widow presented a precarious balance of newfound autonomy and immense vulnerability. She might control her dower lands, a portion of her deceased husband's estate, which could offer some economic independence. But without a man to protect her interests, to negotiate with landlords, to perform the heavy labor, or simply to act as a social shield, she was exposed. Her property could be contested, her person vulnerable. Then there's Robert, maybe 58, a widower from the next village over. His wife, Ilara, died years ago, and his children have long since married off or left. He's got a small holding, a few acres of grain and a couple of scrawny sheep, but he's getting old, his back aches, and his hands aren't as strong as they once were. The loneliness is a heavy cloak, yes, but the practical concerns are far heavier. Who will mend his clothes? Who will cook his meager meals? Who will tend to the garden that provides crucial food? Who will manage the household when he's out in the fields, or when he's too ill to rise from his straw bed? A single man, even an older one, was still seen as a social anomaly, often lacking the domestic support crucial for everyday life. These weren't stories from some rare romantic saga. These were the commonplace realities that drove marriages later in life. It wasn't about love at first sight across the village square. It was about finding someone to share the burden, to combine resources, to secure care in old age, or to simply maintain a functioning household. A widow might bring land, a widower might bring labor or protection. It was a transaction of necessities. The idea of an empty nest was practically alien. Children were economic assets, not burdens to be launched. And when they were gone, the household still needed running. The motivations shifted depending on social class, of course. For the vast majority, the peasants, a late-life marriage was purely about survival and labor. A woman needed a man for his physical strength and protection, for access to land and tools. A man needed a woman for her domestic skills, cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, child-rearing if there were younger children, and crucially, for her labor in the fields. A second marriage for a peasant was less a choice and more a dire necessity, a strategic move to keep starvation from the door. It was an alliance against the harshness of the world, not a blossoming of affection. For the gentry and minor nobility, the stakes were different, but equally practical. A widowed lady of 50 might still control significant estates. Marrying again could be about securing military protection for her lands, finding a competent manager for her holdings, or even furthering the interests of her existing children through a strategic alliance with another family. A widower nobleman, especially one with young heirs, needed a wife to manage his household, oversee his children's upbringing, and maintain his social standing. Love, again, was secondary, if it featured at all. It was about property, power, and prestige. The emotional landscape was probably one of respectful companionship, perhaps even affection, but the initial driving force was always external, always practical. Think about the sheer resilience implied here. These individuals had already lived through so much. They'd seen children born and die, spouses taken by illness, harvests fail, and the constant threat of violence. Yet, they persisted. They saw a problem, the lack of a suitable partner to run a household, manage property, or simply provide companionship and care, and they sought a solution, often through the well-trodden path of marriage. The emotional investment might have been tempered by experience, by the wisdom gained from a life lived in a precarious world. But the need for human connection, for mutual support, for someone to witness your days and share your burdens, that remained. It's a testament to the enduring human spirit, even in the bleakest of times. It still seems wild, doesn't it? That someone like Agnes, who'd seen 2 plagues and buried half her family, might be walking down the aisle again. It tells you something fundamental about human nature and society that we often miss in our romanticized versions of history. These marriages weren't for show. They weren't about grand gestures. They were about the intricate, often desperate dance of daily life in a world that offered very little comfort. They were about keeping the household together, ensuring the fields were sown, and that there was someone there when the long night came. It was about practical arrangements, about the brutal arithmetic of survival, and the enduring need for 2 pairs of hands where one was no longer enough. The reasons were clear, compelling, and profoundly rooted in the exigencies of their time. The details of how they navigated these new unions, the specific rituals, the challenges, and the everyday realities are perhaps even more illuminating. You see, marrying after 50 in the year 1300 wasn't exactly a quest for passionate romance, not as we'd understand it today. That notion, that ideal of finding your soulmate later in life, is a luxury born of centuries of social evolution. No, for medieval folk, particularly those who had seen half a century pass, the decision to bind themselves to another was almost always a cold, hard calculation, a stark necessity. It's a compelling peek into a mindset so alien to our own, yet deeply human in its drive for survival and security. If you're finding this dive into the past as intricate and vital as I am, consider sticking around. There's a whole world of these historical nuances just waiting to be uncovered, and you won't want to miss what we piece together next. Life in 1300 was a brutal, relentless grind. Disease, famine, violence, they weren't abstract threats. They were daily realities that pruned the population relentlessly. Reaching 50 was an achievement in itself, a testament to sheer luck and robust health. But even if you made it, old age brought new vulnerabilities. For the single person, man or woman, the prospects were bleak. Who would care for you when your body began to fail? Who would manage your land if you had any? Who would protect your meager assets from greedy relatives or opportunistic neighbors? This wasn't a choice about wanting a companion. It was often about needing a lifeline. The most common scenario involved a widow or widower. Death was a constant companion, and people remarried quickly, sometimes shockingly so by modern standards. There was little time for prolonged mourning when the harvest needed to be brought in, children needed care, or a craft needed practicing. A man who lost his wife might be left with young children and a farm to run. He needed a woman to manage the household, to feed and clothe the family, to spin and weave. A woman, on the other hand, was in an even more precarious position. Without a man, she might lose her land, her social standing, even her legal capacity. Her options were few: join a convent, become a domestic servant, or remarry. And for those over 50, with no more children to bear, the incentives were different, but no less urgent. Imagine a widow, perhaps a prosperous one. She owned land, maybe a successful workshop. Her children were grown, perhaps married off, or maybe they were still at home eyeing her property. She needed a steward, a protector, someone to stand up for her interests. A husband provided that legal and physical shield. He could manage her affairs, represent her in court, and deter those who might try to exploit her vulnerability. It was a business arrangement, certainly, but one that offered profound security. And for a widower, perhaps a master craftsman or a minor landowner, he needed someone to run his household, perhaps supervise his apprentices, and most importantly, someone to care for him in his dotage. His grown children might have their own families and concerns. A new wife, even an older one, represented immediate, dedicated care. Now, this isn't to say affection or respect were entirely absent. They often grew out of the shared struggle, the mutual dependence. But the primary driver was pragmatic property, succession labor. The merging of two households could create a stronger economic unit, more resilient against the vagaries of medieval life. Two small plots of land becoming one larger, more viable farm. Two sets of tools, two small caches of wealth, now pooled. It made sense. It was rational. The church, for its part, mostly accepted these marriages, while it championed the ideal of lifelong monogamy and frowned upon excessive remarriage, especially for the clergy. It understood the societal need. Marriage was a sacrament, yes, but it was also the bedrock of social order. It legitimized children, even if unlikely after 50. It provided care for the elderly, and it prevented destitution. The Church's primary concern shifted from procreation to the avoidance of sin and the maintenance of stability. But these unions weren't without their complications. Oh, far from it. Imagine the dynamic between a new spouse and the adult children from a previous marriage. This was ripe for conflict. Inheritance was a minefield. Children from the first marriage would naturally view the new spouse, especially if they brought little of their own, as a threat to their rightful inheritance. Disgruntled stepchildren could cause endless trouble, from legal challenges to outright hostility. A man marrying a wealthy widow, for instance, might be accused of fortune hunting. A woman marrying an older man might be seen as trying to usurp the position of his children. Wills and dowries became incredibly complex instruments, trying to navigate these treacherous family waters, often with limited success. The records we have show endless disputes, petitions to courts, and even physical altercations stemming from these new familial configurations. It's fascinating, isn't it, how the very human drive for stability and belonging takes on such starkly different forms across the centuries. To think that what we consider a late-life romance was for them a survival strategy. If these historical shifts in human behavior and motivation intrigue you, there's so much more to uncover about how our ancestors navigated their world. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of these windows into the past. The true climax of understanding marriage after 50 and 1300 isn't some grand love story, but rather the profound realization of human ingenuity and resilience. These were not unions born of whim, but of acute calculation and often sheer desperation. They were societal safety nets, cobbled together by individuals trying to weather an unpredictable existence. The love that emerged was less about passionate attraction and more about the quiet, earned affection that blossoms from mutual aid, shared burdens, and the simple comfort of not facing the harshness of the world alone. It was a deeply practical partnership, where one person's resources, labor, or social standing complemented another's needs. Sometimes these marriages were deeply respected, offering a model of stability. Other times they were viewed with suspicion, fertile ground for gossip and accusations of avarice, but they happened. They were a testament to the fact that even in the most challenging of times, humans found ways to build connections, to create family, and to survive, no matter their age. These marriages, often overshadowed by the grander narratives of younger, more prolific unions, were vital threads in the intricate tapestry of medieval life, ensuring that even those beyond their prime had a place, a purpose, and a partner in an unforgiving world. They remind us that for centuries, before sentimentality took hold, the practical bond was paramount. And that's it. That's the intricate, often brutal, but undeniably human reality of marriage after 50 in 1300. If this exploration has sparked your own curiosity about forgotten corners of history, leave a comment below with what other overlooked historical details you'd like us to explore next.